You're standing at the edge of a small country cemetery in the late afternoon, plain white stones, every one the same size. No marble angels, no polished granite, no gold lettering catching the last of the sun, and a single question is turning over in your mind, the same one that brought you here. If a body is burned down to ash, can Jesus still raise it up? The Amish gave me an answer to that question that I did not expect, and it turned everything I thought I knew about death, the body, and money completely upside down. They refuse cremation, not out of fear, not out of superstition. They refuse it because of something they understand about the human body and about the modern funeral that the rest of us were quietly taught to forget. By the end of this, I'm going to walk you all the way back to a confession of faith written in a Dutch town in 1632 and to a book of records printed in 1660 that together explain why a plain family can lay a loved one to rest for less than the price of a decent used lawnmower, while the rest of us hand over the price of a car. And I want you to hear me clearly right now. This is not just for people living off the grid in a farmhouse with no electricity. What I've found applies to the home you are sitting in tonight. I'll be honest with you. I spent most of my life not thinking about any of this. Then a few autumns back, I was standing in a workshop in Lancaster County, the smell of pine shavings thick in the air, watching an older man named Amish run his hand along a plain board. I asked him what he was building. He said, without looking up, "A box for my brother." He wasn't sad the way I would have been. He was calm, and that calm bothered me for weeks because I could not understand where it came from. This is the story of what I found when I started pulling that thread. Let me start with the question itself, because it is the one nobody wants to ask out loud. Will Jesus raise the cremated? I brought that exact question to more than one plain person, expecting a hard answer. I expected them to tell me that cremation damns you, that ash cannot rise, that the fire is final. That is not what they told me at all. What they told me was gentler and honestly far more interesting. They believe God's power is not limited by what happens to a body. A man lost at sea, a soldier burned in battle, a saint eaten by beasts in the old days of persecution. The Amish do not believe any of those souls are beyond the reach of the resurrection. They believe God can gather a body from anywhere, in any condition. So the short answer they gave me was yes, God is not stopped by ashes. But then Amos said something that stopped me cold. He said, "We do not burn our dead, not because we think God cannot raise them, but because of what the burning says about how we saw the body while it lived." I did not understand that at first. Sit with it, because it is the whole key. To the Amish, the body is not trash to be disposed of in the cheapest, fastest, most convenient way. The body is a gift that was loaned to you, a temple that carried a soul through a life of work and worship and burial. Laying that body gently in the ground to return to the earth the way a seed returns to the soil is their last act of respect for the gift. Cremation to them treats the body as a problem to be gotten rid of. Burial treats it as a person to be honored. That is a clue. Hold on to it, because the deeper I dug, the more I realized that the way we bury our dead in the modern world has almost nothing to do with honoring anyone. It has to do with something else entirely. And to understand what that something else is, I first had to see what an Amish funeral actually looks like from the inside. What I saw did not look like any funeral I had ever attended. Here is what happens when a plain person dies. Therefore, let me walk you through it exactly, because the details are where the shock lives. There is no phone call to a funeral home first. The family stays with the body. In most plain communities, the women of the family and the close neighbors wash the body by hand, the same hands that shared meals and work with that person for years. They dress the body in plain clothing, often white, sometimes clothing the person set aside years earlier for this very day. There is no stranger in a back room. There is no chemical table. There is no bill starting to run the moment the heart stops. The body is then laid out in the home. Not a chapel, not a viewing parlor with piped-in organ music and rented chairs. The home. The same front room where that person ate breakfast. Neighbors come through, hundreds of them sometimes, over the following days. And here is the part that first struck me as impossible in our world. The body is kept cool naturally, often for 2 or 3 days, using nothing but the cold of the room and, in the old way, ice. No embalming, no fluids, no refrigeration unit humming in a basement of a business. The coffin is plain. Usually it is built by a member of the community, sometimes by the family itself, out of simple pine or poplar. 6 boards and a lid tapered at the shoulders in the old style. No brass handles, no velvet lining, no protective sealed vault promising to keep the water out for 1,000 years. When Amos told me his brother's box would cost the family almost nothing but the wood and an afternoon of labor, I asked him what the whole funeral would cost, start to finish. He thought about it and said maybe a few $100, mostly for the plot and the digging, a few $100. I want you to hold that number in your mind, because I am about to tell you what the rest of us pay, and the gap between those 2 numbers is where this whole mystery cracks wide open. The grave itself is often dug by hand by the men of the community, taking turns with shovels. The service is held at the home or the barn. The same wagon that hauls hay hauls the coffin to the cemetery. And those plain white stones I described at the start, all the same size, are that way on purpose. In death, the richest farmer and the poorest laborer get the exact same marker. No one is made bigger by money, no one is made smaller by the lack of it. I stood at one of those cemeteries and I felt something I had never felt at a modern funeral. I felt the absence of a salesman. There was no one there to upsell anyone. And that absence pointed me toward a question I could no longer avoid. If a dignified, loving, complete burial can be done for a few $100s and the work of willing hands, then why does the same event cost the rest of us $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 or more? Somebody built that gap on purpose, and I was determined to find out who and when. So I started digging into the history of the American funeral. And let me tell you, the trail led somewhere I never expected. It led straight to a battlefield. Before the 1860s, most Americans died and were buried a great deal like the Amish still are today. Families cared for their own dead at home. The body was washed and laid out in the parlor, the front room of the house. In fact, that is why we called it the parlor. Neighbors built the coffin, or the local cabinet maker did. The body went into the ground within a day or two, wrapped in a shroud or laid in a simple wooden box, and it returned to the earth. There was no such thing as a funeral home. There was no such thing as embalming for ordinary people. Death was a family matter and a church matter, not a business. Then came the American Civil War, from 1861 to 1865. Here is the piece almost no one knows. Soldiers were dying hundreds of miles from home, and families desperately wanted the bodies of their sons and husbands returned for burial. but a body cannot travel for days in the heat without decay. So a practice that had mostly been used for medical study crept onto the battlefields, embalming, the injecting of chemicals into the body to slow decay long enough for the train ride home. There was a man named Dr. Thomas Holmes, and history remembers him as the father of American embalming. During the war, he is said to have embalmed thousands of soldiers, charging a fee for each one. And when President Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, his embalmed body was carried by train across the country for a viewing tour seen by millions of grieving Americans in city after city. That funeral train did something no advertisement could ever do. It sold the whole nation on the idea of the preserved displayed body. It made embalming look dignified, patriotic, even holy, and a brand new industry was watching. Men realized there was money, steady and reliable money, in death. Because everyone dies, and grieving people do not haggle. Within a few decades, the local cabinet maker who once built a simple coffin as a neighborly favor had transformed into the funeral director, a licensed professional operating a funeral home, selling embalming, selling caskets, selling viewings, selling vaults, selling flowers, selling a whole ritual that our great-grandparents had done themselves for free. Now here's where the tension turns sharp, because this is where the cost of not knowing starts to show up in real dollars. By the middle of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. In 1963, a writer named Jessica Mitford published a book called The American Way of Death, and it landed like a bombshell. She laid out, in plain numbers, how the funeral industry had learned to guide grieving families toward the most expensive choices at the exact moment those families were least able to think clearly. She showed how the loved one language, the soft lighting, the beautiful showroom caskets, were all engineered to make you feel that spending less meant loving less. That book caused such an uproar that it eventually helped push the Federal Trade Commission in 1984 to create what is called the Funeral Rule. And what that rule revealed just by existing tells you everything. The rule forced funeral homes to give you an itemized price list. It forced them to stop requiring you to buy a casket from them. It forced them to tell you the truth about what is and is not legally required. Think about that. The government had to pass a rule forcing these businesses to tell grieving families that most of what they were selling was optional. Because here is the buried fact at the center of all of it. In the United States, embalming is almost never required by law. Not for a normal death. Not for a normal burial within a couple of days. The thing that built the entire modern funeral industry, the thing that turned a few $100s into $9,000, is a service that in most cases you do not have to buy at all. Let that settle. The average traditional funeral in America today, with embalming, a metal casket, a vault, and the funeral home services, runs somewhere between $7,000 and $12,000 depending on where you live. The Amish do the same essential thing: honor the dead, gather the community, return the body to the earth for a few hundred. The difference is not dignity. The difference is not love. The difference is an industry that spent 150 years teaching us to be helpless at the one moment we most need to feel capable. And that word helpless is the real villain here. Not any one businessman, the helplessness itself. Somewhere along the way we were taught that death is too frightening, too complicated, too dangerous, too dirty for ordinary families to handle. We were taught that we need a professional to stand between us and our own dead. The Amish were never taught that. They kept the old knowledge, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, right through the century when the rest of us surrendered it. And they kept it because their faith would not let them hand something this sacred over to a business. If this knowledge matters to you, and I believe it does, or you would not still be here, I want to point you towards something I put together that goes much deeper than what we can cover in a single sitting. It is called Amish Foundations, and it is one of 3 books I wrote under the titles Amish Mastery and the Amish Blueprint as well, each one digging further into the practical wisdom the plain communities preserved while the rest of us were looking away. These books walk you through the history, the specific methods, and the decisions you can make right now, calmly, clearly, before grief ever arrives at your door. You will find the details on how to get them in the description below this video. But now I need to speak directly to you, and I mean you specifically, the person listening to this from an ordinary house on an ordinary street with electricity and a mortgage and neighbors you barely know, thinking this is all very moving, but it could never apply to your life. You are the exact person I most want to reach right now, because what I found next is for you, and you can use part of it this very week. Here is the first thing, and it is the thing that changes the ground under your feet. In the vast majority of states, it is completely lawful for a family to care for their own dead, to keep the body at home, to wash and dress it themselves, to transport it themselves, to hold the viewing in their own front room exactly the way it was done for hundreds of years before the funeral train rolled through. Only a small handful of states place heavy requirements on involving a licensed director, and even in those, families have far more freedom than they have ever been told. This is called a home funeral, and it is not some strange new movement. It is simply the return of the oldest funeral there is. You do not need a contractor. You do not need special tools. You do not need anyone's permission to begin learning this. What you need first is a single decision made while you are calm and clear, long before grief arrives, the decision that when the time comes, your family will not be helpless and will not be stampeded. Sit down and write down what you actually want. Write down that you do not want embalming if it is not required. Write down that you want a simple wooden box, not a sealed metal one. Write down whether you want a viewing at home. Tell your family where that paper is. That single sheet of paper written this week is worth thousands of dollars and a great deal of peace, because it takes the decisions out of the hands of a salesman standing over your grieving children. Here is the second thing you can do inside your existing home, and it is the practical heart of the matter. You can learn, right now, the simple, old, entirely legal method for keeping a body cool at home for the 2 or 3 days a proper viewing takes, without a single chemical and without any professional equipment, because that, my friend, is the exact piece of knowledge the funeral industry most needs you not to have. And it is the very thing the Amish never forgot. So let me take you all the way down to the bottom of this, to the discovery I promised you at the start. When I kept pulling this thread, I kept coming back to those 2 old documents I mentioned, and I want you to understand why they matter, because they are the anchor that holds this whole thing to solid ground. The first is the Dordrecht Confession of Faith, written in the Dutch city of Dordrecht in the year 1632. This is not a vague piece of folklore. It is a specific written confession agreed upon by Anabaptist leaders, and to this day it remains one of the central statements of faith adopted by the Amish. It speaks of the body and the resurrection, of the care owed to one another in the community, of the duty of believers to bear one another's burdens, including, in practice, The burden of burying the dead with their own hands is an act of love rather than a purchased service. The second is a heavy book printed in 1660 by a man named Thieleman van Braght, known as the Martyr's Mirror. It records in painful detail the stories of the Anabaptist believers who were persecuted, tortured, drowned, and burned at the stake in the 15 and 1600s for their faith. Many were burned. Their bodies were destroyed by fire at the hands of their persecutors. And here is why that book matters so much to the question you came here with. Those plain communities have for centuries held in their hands the written memory of their own people being burned to ash. They know in their bones that God promised to raise those martyrs whole. That is precisely why they can tell you with total calm that ashes do not defeat the resurrection. But it is also precisely why they choose burial for their own, because they will not do to their beloved dead by choice what the persecutors did to the martyrs by cruelty. Do you see it now? The refusal of cremation is not a fear that God cannot raise the ashes. It is a refusal to treat the body as the executioners treated it. It is a quiet act of defiance against the idea that a human body is just a thing to be burned away. 400 years of memory carried in one plain choice. Now here is the discovery. Here is the thing I found buried under all of it. The thing that made me put down my coffee and sit very still. The Amish and the old rural families before the funeral homes came kept their dead at home for those 2 or 3 days using a method so simple it sounds impossible. They used cold. In the old accounts and in the practice that survives in plain communities today, the body is laid out in the coolest room of the house, and it is kept cool from beneath and around with ice. In the very old days it was blocks of ice from the ice house, laid in the coffin or in vessels tucked around and under the body, wrapped in cloth, changed as they melted. There was even a specialized board, called a cooling board, that the body was laid upon to allow air and cold to circulate, keeping the body preserved with dignity for the days of mourning and viewing. And here is the part that matters for you tonight in your modern home. That exact principle still works, and it requires nothing but what you can buy at any store, ordinary ice, or better still, dry ice, the frozen carbon dioxide sold at many grocery stores and ice companies, placed properly, wrapped in cloth or towels, positioned under the torso and around the body, and refreshed as needed. Cold will keep a body safe and presentable for the 2 or 3 days a home viewing takes. It is the same cold that has always worked. It is the reason our ancestors never needed a drop of embalming fluid, and the reason the Amish do not need it now. The funeral train and the industry it created did not invent a better way. They simply took an ancient, free, dignified way and hid it behind a price tag. I sat with that for a long time. 150 years of Americans being told that the human body is a biohazard the moment life leaves it, that only a licensed professional with chemicals could keep a grandmother presentable for her own grandchildren to say goodbye. And the whole time the answer was cold. Just cold. The same thing that kept the milk and the meat on every farm in this country for 1,000 years. The Amish never forgot it because they never handed their dead to a stranger. And now you know it too. Think about what that means. A family that knows this cannot be made helpless. A family that knows this cannot be stampeded at the worst hour of their lives into $9,000 of purchases they were told were necessary and were not. A family that knows this can wash their own mother, dress her in the clothes she loved, lay her in a plain box built by hands that knew her, keep her cool and peaceful in her own home for 3 days, while everyone who loved her comes to say goodbye, and then lay her gently in the earth for a few $100 with their own hands, the way it was done for all of human history until the year our great-grandparents were talked out of it. That is what the Amish protected. Not a superstition about fire and ashes, a whole way of meeting death that keeps the family strong, keeps the money in the family, and keeps a stranger's business out of the most sacred hours a family will ever share. They did not preserve it by writing books or passing laws. They preserved it by simply refusing to stop doing it, one funeral at a time, one plain pine box at a time, for 400 years, straight through the century when the rest of us were told to look away. So let me bring you back to that cemetery where we started, with the plain white stones all the same size. You asked whether Jesus can raise the cremated, and the answer the Amish gave was yes. God's arm is not shortened by fire or ashes or the bottom of the sea. But underneath that answer was a much larger truth they were trying to hand you. The way we treat the body in death is a mirror of how we understood it in life. And somewhere along the way, most of us were quietly convinced that our own dead were too much for us to handle, that our own bodies were too frightening to touch, that the last act of love had to be bought from a store. The Amish never believed that lie, and standing at the edge of that quiet cemetery, I finally understood the calm I saw in Amos's face over his brother's coffin. It was not the calm of a man who feared death less. It was the calm of a man who had never surrendered it to anyone. If any part of this stirred something in you, it is because you already suspected it. You are the kind of person who has felt, more than once, that something true and useful and yours was taken away and sold back to you at a markup in your medicine, in your food, in your home, and yes, even in your death. You were right. You were right the whole time, and the good news is that this particular piece of it was never actually lost. It was only set down. You can pick it back up this week with a single sheet of paper and the knowledge of how cold has always done the work that chemicals were sold to replace. Now I want to hear from you, and I am asking you directly, because I know this crowd reads quietly and moves on. Tell me one thing in the comments. When you last stood at a funeral and looked at the bill, or watched a family member sign for a casket in a showroom, did some quiet part of you feel that all of it was too much? That it did not match the simple thing that was actually happening? Tell me about that moment. Say it plainly. Somebody else needs to read that they were not the only one who felt it. And if you want to keep recovering the things that were set down and sold back to us, come along with the rest of us who are digging these up one at a time. Because the next thing I found is about how the Amish handle the days right after a death, the way the whole community feeds and shelters the grieving family so that no one carries the weight alone. And there is one specific custom they follow in those first 3 days that quietly solved a problem our modern world spends a fortune failing to fix. I'll show you exactly what it is and where I found it next. Before you go, one thing. This video gave you the overview, but the full Amish burial from the confession all the way to the graveside is waiting inside the plain living circle. In there you can ask me your own question, and a real person, me, answers you myself. And you won't be alone. So many plain living folks like you are already there. Just point your phone's camera at the code. You can cancel any time, no risk.